This welcome. We are excited also to be able to share this with a couple of our classes. The recording will be shared in a couple of our courses, so we're really excited about that. Dr. Benjamin Johnson is the director of the Honors College and associate professor of biblical studies at LeTourneau.
LeTourneau?
Okay. Want to make sure I said that correctly. And a university in Texas. Before that, he was a member of the Faculty of Religion and Theology Studies at Oxford University and taught at Wycliffe Hall. Doctoral research at Durham University on the Greek translation of David and Goliath's story. He's always found fascination with the character of David, turning this story, looking at the story over and over again. But his interest really is driven from a conviction that biblical story has the power to transform our lives, and we ought to return to it continually. The stories might shape us in light of the biblical story. Very widely published, lots of cool journal articles and chapters. I came into Dr. Johnson's work through his newest book about David, and read it over Christmas break and was just really, I just was really taken by the scholarship, but also just how accessible it was, especially the questions at the end. I thought, oh my gosh, like this is going to get in the hands of my church members, and just was really thankful for scholarship at a level that could really, a lot of people could handle. So Dr. Johnson, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Dr. Music. That really kind words. And I'm glad to have had this invite from this book. I have been thinking about David for a long time. It's been my area of interest and scholarship, and I'm pleased that you found the book accessible. That's what I was going for. I do feel like we probably have an additional personal spiritual connection between LeTourneau and UPike. I saw that your guys' tagline is "Move Mountains." Our founder's tagline was "Mover of Men and Mountains." So there must be some sort of connection there. I'm not quite sure what to make of it. But when I teach on David in my classes for my students, I always start with a bunch of quotes to kind of get the flavor of people's thoughts about who David is and different perspectives. A couple of them are Joel Baden in his book, The Historical David, writes, "David was a successful monarch, but he was a vile human being." Right, that's one perspective. Perhaps a little bit more nuanced. David Wolpe writes, "A warrior poet, wily as Odysseus, tortured as Lear, yet as faithful as the shepherd of Israel." Or perhaps capturing the duality of David, K.L. Noel writes, "David is good and evil, hot and cold, lovable and worthy of admiration, frightening in his disregard for the welfare of others. David is fully human in his anguished cry for his son Absalom, fully monster in his written order of execution sent by the hand of Uriah." Or God's perspective, perhaps, in 1 Kings 14, "My servant David, who kept my commandments and who walked after me with all his heart, doing only what was right in my eyes." To which I usually ask, God, are you reading the same story we're reading? And then David's perspective on himself with the question that he asks multiple times in his story, "What have I done now?" That to me kind of captures the issue of the character of David. I have been drawn to this character for a long time, since I was a kid reading children's Bibles and David and Goliath. And then as an adult, reading the story about this man who is described as a man after God's own heart, and yet who does some pretty atrocious things. David is one of the most significant characters in the Bible, and I think probably you could make the case in all of world literature. He has been called the first human being in world literature, and that is because he is one of the earliest complex characters that we see in ancient literature. There's a tendency for characters to be one-dimensional, to be more like types in ancient literature. But in David, we do truly see a complicated human being struggling, growing, falling, learning. And so if that's who he is, if he is described as the first human being in world literature, if he is described as a man after God's own heart, then maybe David's story has something to teach us about what it means to be a human being and what it means to, according to the text, follow after God's heart. If you think about his legacy, how he's known, he's the slayer of the Philistines, the hero of Israel. Then he's the poet in the Psalms. In Kings, he's the paradigmatic good king. All kings are compared to him. He's the prophetic hope of Israel. If you look at the prophetic texts, it's his legacy that the prophetic texts point to. And he's famously the ancestor of Jesus. Jesus identifies as the son of David. It's hard to collect greater accolades in terms of legacy and importance than that. So the issue that I find when I study the character of David is we're introduced to him in 1 Samuel 13 in the rejection of Saul. So Saul is the first king in Israel, and he is begrudgingly appointed by God, it seems, and then goes wrong in two different instances. And we read about Samuel coming to Saul and saying, now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him to be ruler over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. And so we're introduced to the idea of David, the idea of this person who is a man after God's own heart, which I presume the text means us to read positively, that there is something about this character that is significant and positive. So we start with expectations of David. Then, as I mentioned, when he does come on the scene, Samuel sees him, and God says, approves his heart in some way, in a text that we'll look at in a little bit. And as I've already mentioned, in the book of Kings, the refrain of the book of Kings, I don't know how much you know about the book of Kings, but the book of Kings is like a university, but it's pass-fail grades. Kings either do well in the eyes of the Lord, or they do evil in the eyes of the Lord. But the benchmark, the prototype, seems to be the character of David. A scholar from an earlier generation, Gerhard von Rad, writes that David is the prototype of the perfectly obedient anointed, and therefore the model for all succeeding kings in Jerusalem. And if you read a few texts in the book of Kings, you can see that. For example, Abijam is said in 1 Kings 15 that he committed all the sins that his father did before him. His heart was not true to the Lord his God like the heart of his father David. You see the comparison there to David and David's heart, implying that there is something positive in David's heart. Conversely, Asa, in 1 Kings 15, Asa did what was right in the sight of the Lord, as his father David had done. And we could go through the list. Josiah, Solomon, the famous kings are often and frequently compared to David. There seems to be something positive about this character of David that the text wants us to see. Or if we turn to the New Testament, Paul's sermon in Acts 13, when he goes through the story of Israel, includes a reference to David, their king, and in his testimony about him, he said, I have found David, son of Jesse, to be a man after my heart, who will carry out all my wishes. So this refrain goes throughout the tradition, from the book of Samuel through the book of Kings into the New Testament, even when Peter is recounting Israel's story. There is this refrain. Most of us hear about this phrase from Sunday school, a man after God's own heart, which to me, from a Christian perspective, sounded like something inherently that I would want to be like. But then you read David's story, and then you start asking, well, what is it in this guy's story that I want to be like? Because the problem is, there is a lot in David's story that you would not want to emulate. So what is the writer talking about, referring to him as a man after God's own heart? This is a question that has puzzled me. And in the book, I introduce David and walk through his story. But one of the kind of driving questions is this one. What do we make of this guy? And what is it about him that could possibly lead us to describe him as a man after God's own heart? Because he is certainly not a purely positively characterized actor. The most obvious story where David does not come off well is the famous case of David and Bathsheba. If you remember that story, it starts off, David is now settled in Jerusalem, and the Lord has established his kingdom. All good things have happened to David, and now he is, as it says in verse 1 of 2 Samuel 11, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. So we have a story that starts, when kings go out to battle, David remained in Jerusalem. So we're meant to perhaps see, is this guy doing what he's supposed to do? Then the story goes, David is relaxing on his rooftop and he sees a bathing beauty, desires her, inquires about who she is, which is one piece of the story that not everyone pays attention to. But the fact of inquiring who she is and then finding out who she is invites her over. He finds out that this is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, who we as readers won't learn until later, but who David certainly knows. Uriah the Hittite is one of David's 30 mighty men, according to 2 Samuel 23. So this is a trusted warrior's wife. Presumably, this is not the first time David has met Bathsheba. This is someone who he knows. And we forget that there's a personal connection to this betrayal sometimes, which makes the betrayal all the more worse. So what happens is David sleeps with Bathsheba, gets her pregnant, and then the cover-up story ensues. David invites Uriah back, and Uriah refuses to go in to see his wife. Why should I go and be with my wife in my home when my Lord and the ark is out at battle, basically, Uriah says. So it doesn't work out. His cover story of trying to get Uriah to sleep with his wife and so that her pregnancy will not become front page news doesn't work. So David tries to get him drunk, thinking a drunk Uriah is more likely to go home and be with his wife. But Uriah again refuses, which leads one commentator to write that the irony of this story shows that Uriah drunk is more righteous than David sober, which is problematic for the king of Israel, who ought to be more upright and upstanding than Uriah the Hittite. So ironies abound in this story. So David comes up with plan B, which is Uriah has to die. And the way that he has Uriah killed is to write a death warrant and give it to Uriah himself to deliver to his commander, Joab, which has to be one of the coldest betrayals in all of literature. I remember a few years ago, Barnes & Noble published a list of the greatest traitors in literature, and they included things like Brutus, who betrayed Julius Caesar. They included Dennis Nedry, who betrayed Jurassic Park, and of course, Edmund Pevensey, who betrayed Narnia, as some of the worst traitors. David has got to go on that list. This is one of the worst betrayals, I think, in literature. If his sending a note with Uriah is not as bad as Judas's kiss, I don't know what is. So he has Uriah killed, and this story is relentless in its negative characterization of David. And the text recognizes that David did all that was right, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. And very often, people think of David as this good, upright character, the hero of Israel, the poet of the Psalms, who had this one bad moment with Bathsheba and Uriah. But I don't think that's quite accurate either. This is just the most obvious and egregious negative characterization of David. But his problems go a lot deeper than that. All through his story, there are questionable elements to it. If we go all the way back to his first words, when he shows up as a shepherd boy on the battlefield and he hears Goliath's taunt, Goliath is taunting the ranks of Israel, David's first words are these: "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Now, Robert Alter is a famous Hebrew Bible scholar who has said that a character's first words in Hebrew narrative are very often a defining moment of characterization for that character. If you think about the character of Saul, known a little bit for his timidity, his first words in the narrative are, "Let's turn back." If you think about the patriarch Jacob, who is known for being the trickster and the deceiver, his first words are, "Sell me first your birthright." So there is this tradition of the first words a character saying being particularly significant for understanding who they are and what they're about. Well, David's first words are, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine?" and takes away the reproach from Israel. So scholars have pointed out and said, for one example, Robert Polzin writes, from the moment David enters the picture, he comes across as someone who is as much self-serving as God-fearing. Or as Marty Stussy writes, that David has one eye on God and the other watches greedily for reward. So even in his introduction, we're introduced to a complex character who we see has at least ambitious intentions, but who also has a pious side. What should be done for the man who kills this Philistine? Who takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And in that first statement, I think we capture this duality of David. He gets credit for some spiritual vitality, for some theological understanding of the situation. He gets credit for that, but he also is ambitious, at least ambitious, if not possibly self-centered and conniving as well. So even in the first words, which seem innocuous, they're his famous rise to glory in the Battle of Goliath, we're introduced to a slightly more complicated character than first appears. And if you go through the story, this kind of complication abounds. I mean, down to after he's won the victory with Goliath, and Saul, the king of Israel, starts to become jealous of him and decides to marry off one of his daughters to him in order to get him killed. It says David was pleased to be the king's son-in-law. Now, interestingly, the text had told us that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, but it doesn't tell us ever that David loved Michal. It says David was pleased to be the king's son-in-law. Now, is he pleased because he does want to marry Michal and he has some personal connection to her, or because he likes the idea of the status it will give him? The text isn't clear, but it leaves that open. His later treatment of Michal will be pretty harsh and hard to deal with. David's story all the way through, if you look at when David finally has to flee Saul, we see him lying to a priest, which doesn't seem like a good idea, pretending to be insane. We see him taking credit for Saul's slaughter of the priests of Nob, because David knew at least he was risking their safety. We see perhaps famously David's character in his interactions with Nabal and Abigail. So I don't know if you remember this story, but when David is on the run from Saul, he seems to be running something like a protection racket and is protecting the flocks of this wealthy landowner named Nabal out in the wilderness. And he hears that Nabal is shearing his sheep, having his harvest, and he goes with perhaps a bill and says, "We have been protecting your shepherds, come pay me what is due." Nabal asks the question, "Who are you? Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse?" Implying that he knows exactly who he is, but saying, many slaves are breaking away from their master these days. Why should I take away food from my men and give it to someone who I don't know where they come from? And which seems to be an insult in terms of a hospitality culture of the ancient Near East. So Nabal is not a positive character either. But David's response is to say, "Each man strap on your sword, and may God do thus and so to me, if even one," in the famous KJV, "even one of those who pisseth against the wall, remains alive by morning." Basically saying, you have insulted me and refused to pay, and I am going to wipe out all the males of your household. Which seems a bit of an overreaction. And maybe we see, as one character has said, we see in this that David has a dark side. We see that he has an impulse towards violence, which is scary in the warrior king. The story doesn't get better from there. We could read through David's letting Joab get away with murder. We could read through David's failure to punish his sons when they go wrong. David's story is marked by questionable and complex actions. We could read through when David joins the Philistines and becomes a Philistine mercenary and goes on raids and wipes out entire villages in order that word not get back to his Philistine landlord. David is marked by questionable activity and questionable actions throughout his story. So that to me sets up the problem. There's this phrase of David, a man after God's own heart, that goes all the way through the tradition. This is who he is. This is a memory of him and his characterization that is significant. But his story is marked by a guy who is at least of questionable character. So it doesn't make sense to me. The Bible never tells us this is what it means that David was a man after God's own heart. Which leads me to go, well, maybe one way into this question would be to look at the references to David's heart in the story. And there's not that many. There's a half a dozen or so places where the text actually references David's heart. So what could we learn about David's heart if we approach the story this way? And so that's what I'll do here in the last half of this talk, is to kind of just walk through a little bit what I do in the book and how I conclude, to see where that gets us. So the first reference to David's heart we've already mentioned is in 1 Samuel 13. This is the rejection of Saul and the declaration that the Lord is choosing someone else. So this is Samuel saying to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. The Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart." So the first reference to David's heart is even before he's on the scene, and it seems to be a comparison to Saul. We seem to have a comparison of Saul has done foolishly, and God will now choose someone who does well. So there is an action element involved in what this phrase means, after God's own heart. So the first thing we see in reference to David's heart is in contrast with Saul some way, specifically with his doing foolishly and not keeping the commandment that the Lord gave him. That's a whole other can of worms to open up that 1 Samuel 13, and exactly what Saul did wrong there is a quagmire of its own, but we'll skip over that for now. The second reference that we see to David's heart is in 1 Samuel 16, when David is anointed. So after Samuel rejects Saul, the Lord says to him, "Why are you still crying over this guy? I've moved on. Go to Jesse. I have seen amongst his sons a king for myself." So Samuel goes to Bethlehem, sees Jesse's sons, and sees Eliab. And he says, when he looked at Eliab, he thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is now before the Lord." But the Lord responds to him and says, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." So Samuel has gone from Saul, who, if you remember, is head and shoulders taller than everybody. He's the tall, strapping dude in Israel, and has seen a Saul replacement in Eliab, who apparently has great stature and appearance, and said, "This is the guy." To which the Lord has to correct him and say, "No, don't look on his appearance. God sees differently than human beings see." And perhaps it's at this point that it's worth reflecting on what the heart represents in Hebrew anthropology. Sometimes we make the mistake of thinking hallmark thoughts when we think about the heart in the Bible. It's the seat of the emotions. It has Cupids involved with it for some reason. And that's not what the heart represents in Hebrew thinking. That the heart is sometimes described as the seat of the will or the intellect. But I think the thing that you see in this passage here is that the heart is the interiority. It is that part of you that cannot be accessed. It is the core of who you are. That is where your seat of will and intellect happens. There's emotion that can be connected to it, but it's something like your innermost self that only God truly has access to. This helps us a little bit when we're looking at David, because it tells us that only God has access to what is good in David. We don't fully have it. So the fact that we see some mismatch between what God says about David being a man after God's own heart and his actions, there is some hope for us. There is something there that is maybe not obvious, that God sees that others do not see. But this text does imply that there is something about David. God has seen that we are going to just have to figure out as best as we can. The next passage that references David's heart is actually a warning. So after David is anointed in front of his brothers, which I assume has to annoy all older brothers, that the younger brother gets anointed, speaking as an older brother myself, his older brothers go off to war with Saul, and David is sent by his father to go bring them snacks and see how they're doing. For my students, my references are always Veggie Tales, because that resonates with them. So in Veggie Tales, he's bringing them a pizza. So he goes and sees the giant Goliath, and begins talking amongst the people. And Eliab, his brother, approaches him and says, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. It says in 1 Samuel 17, he said, "Why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down just to see the battle." So this next reference to David's heart is actually a warning. Is there something right about David's heart or not? This was in response to David's first words, if you remember, we've mentioned before. What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So we're given a warning about David's heart, but we're also in a position to know that Eliab doesn't quite have it right. God has said something positive about David's heart, so Eliab is not fully in line with what God is saying. But it's enough to at least make us think twice. Even if we know Eliab doesn't quite have it all right, we're at least, as readers, we have to wrestle with, do we really know what's in David's heart? I'm not sure. To David's response, "What have I done now? It was only a question." And he turned away and spoke in the same way. So this confrontation between Eliab and David sets us up to at least be suspicious of David's heart, even if we still think that he can be said to be a man after God's own heart. So David then is taken to Saul after he has volunteered to fight Goliath, and once again, heart language comes up. David says to Saul in 1 Samuel 17, verse 32, "Let not anyone's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight the Philistine." Now, interestingly, in the Septuagint translation, which may be based on an earlier Hebrew, it says, "Let not my Lord's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." So either David is being characterized as the one who is willing to fight Goliath when no one else will, or David is being characterized as the one who is willing to fight Goliath when Saul will not. Saul, after all, is the Israelite Goliath, being head and shoulders taller than everyone in Israel. He is the one who is, you would expect to face this challenge. So one of the things that we see about David's heart in this instance is a heart that will not fail, a willingness to take on the enemy of Israel, and that willingness is not present in Saul or anyone else. So there is something positive about being that man of action, the one who is willing to do what God has for them to do, it seems. The next reference is after David has killed Goliath. He has been brought into Saul's court. Saul and David start out as buddies, but it turns sour pretty quickly when you have what seems like an incompetent leader in Saul and a competent underling. That's never a good relationship. And Saul very quickly becomes jealous of David and tries to have him killed through trickery, and then eventually is just fully branding him as a traitor. So David is out on the run. And David has seemed to have the knack of guerrilla warfare and hiding amongst the rocks. So one time, as Saul is searching for him, David and his men are hiding in a cave, which presumably must be some cave if all his men are hiding in that. And it just happens to be the cave where Saul decides to go relieve himself. And it always surprises people that there's toilet humor in the Bible, but there definitely is. There is definitely crass references and humor in the Bible, and this is one of them. So you can imagine an Israelite reader picturing this scenario of Saul squatting in a cave and David sneaking up on him. I think we're meant to see a little chuckle at Saul's expense. We're also probably meant to see God at work because of this great coincidence. The Old Testament narrative is fantastic in that it doesn't always package things and hand us things. Sometimes it makes us kind of think. And one of the principles that I see happen regularly is this principle of coincidence. And it seems that very often the text wants to see that in biblical narrative, coincidence is evidence of providence. And that is probably what we see here. And David's men interpret it that way. God has handed you Saul, your enemy. Strike him down. David, instead of striking him down, seems to strike him down symbolically and cut off a corner of his robe. But even that violent action was enough to affect his heart. As we read that afterward, David was stricken to the heart because he had cut off a corner of Saul's cloak. So what we see here is David's heart has the capacity for perhaps repentance, but to recognize wrongdoing at least. And that is a theme that will come up in a number of these other heart references. So he then, tells Saul, look what I could, here's your robe, look what I could have done. And he's held up as more righteous. And Saul returns, but the flight after David continues later. And then in another really significant text, we see, which we've referenced before, the David, Nabal, and Abigail. I mentioned before that Nabal refuses payment, whether or not it was justified or not. David takes it very badly and intends to wipe out all the males of David's of Nabal's household. But Abigail, the wife of Nabal, is much more shrewd. She sends gifts to David, she sends payment, and goes and does obeisance before him and talks him down. But one of the things she says in 1 Samuel 25 is, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience is the way the NRSV translates it. But it's more literally translated as something like a stumbling of the heart. So my Lord shall have no cause of grief or stumbling of the heart for having shed blood without cause or for having saved himself. In this case, David avoids needing to be stricken to the heart because he doesn't carry through the action. And he takes course correction from another character. Now, he won't always take people's advice, but his heart seems to have the capacity of taking course correction, and that seems to be significant. The next reference to David's heart is after this event. David is tired of being on the run from Saul, and we read this in chapter 27. David says in his heart, I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand. Now, to say something in your heart in the Hebrew Bible is just to say something internally. You speak to your heart is a way of, you could translate, and David thought. But since I think heart language is significant in David's story, it's worth seeing that David's heart is capable of fear and operating out of fear. And I do think that his men and us readers are also meant to be a little shocked and think he's joking. There's nothing better for me to escape to the land of the Philistines. Yeah, right. David, slayer of the Philistines, slayer of Goliath. Sure. Oh, wait, you mean that? You actually mean that? It is a shock in the story that David, the slayer of Philistines, becomes a Philistine mercenary. But that's a fascinating thing. That the treatment of the other in David's story is a whole other fascinating segment, because it's very complex. How David interacts with the Philistines is surprisingly complex. But what we see is his decision making out of fear leads him down this road of serving the Philistines, and it does not go well for a long time. He is raiding and violent. His Men almost turn on him because his town is sacked by the Amalekites. And this is not a happy moment in David's story. And the reference to God disappears until later in the story, when David turns back and asks the Lord if he should pursue the Amalekites who have just raided his town. And then things start to turn around. So you do wonder if this phrase, David said in his heart, I shall perish one day, operating out of fear, has caused him to turn away from having a heart after the Lord in some way. Perhaps the most significant passage is the famous covenant with David in 2 Samuel 7, right? So after Saul has died, David is established on the throne. He has peace from his enemies. He looks around and says, look, I live in a house of cedar and the Lord lives in a bunch of curtains. He says this to the prophet Nathan and just says, this isn't right. And he intends to build a temple for the Lord, which sounds like a good idea. Nathan agrees. The prophet says, go, do all that you have in mind, for the Lord is with you. Now, that more literally would be, go, do all that you have in your heart, for the Lord is with you. Nathan then has to backpedal fairly quickly and go, oh, remember how I told you that whatever was in your heart you should do? Yeah, turns out don't do that because it wasn't in the Lord's heart. And God has to correct David. It's fascinating to me in this scene that this is God's covenant with David, and it's in many ways the high point of his story. God is committing to David and his house, and his promising that he will have a son on the throne forever, and David's son will be considered God's son. But God is actually holding David at a distance. God says, whoa, wait, David, it doesn't matter what you say, it matters what I say. It doesn't matter what's in your heart, it matters what's in my heart. Walter Brueggemann, one of my favorite Old Testament scholars, in his book on David, points out that David is not allowed to behave the way all kings in the ancient world behave. Maybe all kings get their way and build temples for their gods, but not this king and not this God. There is a difference. David is kind of held at arm's length and said he does not get to run the show. Maybe too many things have gone well for David up at this point, and he's confusing David's will with God's will, and God is having to correct him. So David responds to this correction with a prayer. And later in verse 27 of this chapter, 2 Samuel 7, we read, for you, O Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, have made this revelation to your servant, saying, I will build you a house. Therefore, your servant has found courage to pray this prayer for you. Now, literally, and this is a unique phrase in the Hebrew Bible, it says, your servant has found his heart. So to me, what has happened in this is David has had a good idea that the Lord has not approved. Nathan has said, go, do all that's in your heart. The Lord has corrected him, and David has said, aha, in this correction, I have found my heart. So perhaps this suggests that David has learned what it means to be a man after God's own heart. And it means having one's heart tuned to or inclined after God's. Accepting God's course correction and God's gracious promise to him has recalibrated David into a man after God's own heart. Now, the last couple of references to David's heart come after this episode, and we have the terrible story of Uriah and Bathsheba, which we mentioned earlier. David's story kind of falls apart after that, and it just goes downhill for quite a while. You see the ramifications of David's sin and David's trouble in this intergenerational thing that happens. So just as David raped Bathsheba and it led to death, so his son Amnon will then rape his daughter Tamar, which will lead to this cycle of death. So Amnon, who seems to be tragically a knock off the block of David, desires his half-sister Tamar, rapes her, then shuns her, which leads her full brother Absalom to seek revenge, which he does. He plots, he waits 2 years, he plots this murder story. He invites all of his brothers to a feast, including Amnon, then has Amnon killed at this feast. And here we see another reference to David's heart. David, hearing about this event, first hears that all his sons have been killed by Absalom. And a character speaks up and says, "Now therefore, do not let my lord the king take it to heart." Right. As if all the king's sons were dead, for Amnon alone is dead. Don't worry, David, it's not all your sons, it's just the one who seems to be your favorite. But David's heart does seem to be focused on his sons. And then after Absalom has murdered Amnon, he flees. And we read Joab, David's right-hand man, having this perspective. Now, Joab, the son of Zeruiah, perceived that the king's heart was on Absalom. Whether that is wanting to reconcile with Absalom or avenge himself on Absalom is a little unclear, and you could interpret that a couple different ways. But we have two references to David's heart being on his sons, which seems like a good thing. But in this context, perhaps it subtly communicates that David is capable of having his heart inclined towards something other than God. And in this case, it marks the darkest point in David's life. In fact, the Septuagint text, when it reads that David did not punish Amnon for the murder of Tamar, adds a phrase that says, because he was not willing to punish him because he was his eldest. So there is this preferential, according to the Septuagint text, there's a preferential treatment of Amnon that seems inappropriate. I cannot imagine as a father being in that situation what the action is if your son rapes your daughter, but doing nothing certainly isn't the right action. So David's heart seems to be inappropriately on his sons in some way, and it leads to the darkest point in David's life, where his own son rebels against him and is killed in the rebellion. So finally, the last reference to David's heart is at the end of his story, or at least the end of the narrative. Where it fits chronologically is difficult to say. David commits this inappropriate census and recognizes, before the punishment comes, recognizes that he shouldn't, because in 2 Samuel 24:10 it reads, David was stricken to the heart because he had numbered the people and said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. And this final reference to David's heart is again about his capacity for regret and repentance. And this is the last reference to David's heart in the Bible, and it's really the conclusion of the book of Samuel, and it's really the conclusion of the book of Samuel. So if I kind of step back and go, okay, what have we just seen as we've looked at David's heart? We see a couple of things. We see the storytelling about God using and approving of a man who may have evil in his heart, as Eliab suggested, was capable of operating out of fear, and who at times overly focused on his sons to great disaster. However, we see a man whose heart is obedient and contrasted with the disobedient Saul in the reference in 1 Samuel 13. We see a heart that is obedient and not fearful, contrasted with the fearful Saul and Israel. We see someone who has a heart that is able of being convicted of wrongdoing by other characters, and we see someone who has a heart that is willing to be aligned and realigned with God in a number of instances, especially 2 Samuel 7. So maybe what it means to be a man after God's own heart is to have a heart that is able to be aligned and realigned. So perhaps being aligned and realigned your innermost self with God's innermost self is what it means to be a man after God's own heart. And if what it means to be human is to be made in the image of God, which is what the Hebrew Bible makes clear, then the capacity to be reoriented toward God is crucial to that purpose. Maybe that's part of what David can teach us about what it means to be human, to be someone whose heart is after God's heart. It's as much about the struggle and our capacity to change and accept course correction as anything. The ability to go wrong and wrong again, and then be pulled back onto the right course. Maybe that is the significant piece of what it means to be human, according to this story. So for me, seeing David as a man after God's own heart seems more about his struggle to be that than him as a finished product. And perhaps that gives me at least, and maybe the rest of us who are also not finished products, some hope. And I think that's enough for me. Thanks for having me out. I don't know what time you have, but that's my spiel.
Wow, this is so great. I mean, if you only gave us a few things to think about, right? I mean, my goodness. I know there was at least one question that came in. The question is this. I think this was in relationship to when you were talking about David's heart and wanting to build the temple, and then and it says how we worship this God matters to him, and thus we cannot do it like others worship their gods.
Right.
So, okay. Other questions from or I guess other statements or questions from our participants today? Anyone have anything they want to share?
I want to share some. I find it fascinating, kind of the parallels with the redemption stories, like, sparing Sodom and Gomorrah, then destroying them, the flood, and then the being led out of Egypt, then wandering the wilderness after the golden calf incident. And I mean, the whole New Testament says this nation of Israel is worth writing about.
Right.
And so in some sense, David kind of sounds like a microcosm. This person's worth writing about.
Yeah. There's no doubt. David does not, Israel's story is this back and forth of being constantly pulled back to being in line with God. And it's not just being in line with God for that sake, is if you read Genesis, that is what it means to be human, is to live as God intended. It's I'm trying to get you all to live rightly as human beings, how I've intended and designed you. And Israel is constantly being pulled back, and the golden calf is a famous example. And I think we see that in David, and that might be why David's story is this complex story, and why we spend so much time on him, is because he's really no different from any other Israelite who has this tendency to go wrong, but it's that ability to be called back. And maybe that's what the significance of free will is that we have that capacity to be reoriented towards God. And that's what makes us human beings, and that's what makes us capable of turning to him in the first place.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question here. So in the literature, in the first, second Samuel, first, second Kings, do you see any evidence of David's fall, of repeated mistakes or going away from God, when he is not in that alignment? Like we see, example of Christ, right? He was constantly dependent on his Father,
Right.
and he was fully human, fully divine, but he depended on his Father to overcome the world. So, how did you see any evidence in this Old Testament text about David's when he was aligned? He spoke, represented God, spoke for God. There is the spiritual bravery, courage. And then when he was misaligned, there is this dark side comes up, that human.
Yeah, I think that's what this understanding of David as a man after God's heart is trying to get us at a little bit. It's interesting, there's no reference to David's heart in the Bathsheba and Uriah episode. And so what we see is David behaving as the king is not supposed to behave. When he's supposed to be out at war, he's hanging back and enjoying the spoils of his success. And he has one of his worst moments. When his the incident that then leads to the most horrible parts of his story, when his own son rebels against him, are when it says his heart is on his sons. And so that's where his focus is. When he is another one of his horrible episodes, when he is a Philistine mercenary and seems to be killing without mercy, his heart is operating out of fear. He says in his heart, I will surely be killed. And so some of his worst episodes do seem to be, when he is not having his heart aligned with God. And so the two examples where you see it positively is the Nabal and Abigail story, where you see he's going to go wipe everyone out, and he allows his heart to be realigned and does not commit that atrocity, or in the temple episode where he is doing something that seems to be inappropriate and he becomes realigned, and that's where God commits to him and his line for in perpetuity. So that's a great insight.
Thank you.
I have one last question. If anyone else have any questions before we let Dr. Johnson off for his time, this has just been so helpful. But if I want to take the applications of what you're sharing from Scripture and kind of take into kind of a modern, relevant problem, I mean, each day when I'm reading Christianity Today, it's like one major leader after the next is falling, canceling, etc.
Yep.
You know, and if we look at David as the preeminent king and this great figure in the Old Testament to at least pay attention to and look at, what would you say is an implication for kind of contemporary Christian leadership and how we're handling contemporary Christian leaders?
Well, I wrote an article for just a short article for our local newspaper a while back, thinking about leadership and the David story. And I mean, if you look at leaders today, I mean, from political leaders on down, where is the ability, the capacity to change one's mind or accept course correction lauded, right? Like, when have you ever heard a political leader or another leader going, you know what, I used to think that, now I think this because I've thought better. Like, the ability to change and accept course correction does not seem to me to be held up as this great virtue. But that does seem to me, that capacity to change and to go, I was on the wrong path, I'm going on the right path. I think that's really important and significant. And we need to have that ability. The idea that we are finished products and I've got all the answers, and I think that's just wrong. And you see, you know, Christian church leaders especially are guilty of this because they're supposed to be held up as this paragon of faith. And when they don't hold up to it, I think there's an internal pressure not to admit to it because they're supposed to be this finished product. And so I think one of the reasons that you see Christian leaders fall so hard is because they're not willing to admit mistakes early. They're kind of putting up a facade. And David is the classic character of willing to accept course correction. And I think I wish we saw that in political leaders, in Christian leaders, and go, you know what? I changed my mind, and that's okay. People admit that changing their mind is very often not seen as a virtue. But I think that we're all working through stuff. None of us have final answers. And I think we'd have better discourse and better communities if we would admit that up front, that none of us have final answers, and it's worth having dialogues about things. And I might have to change, and you might have to change. So that to me is one of the things that I take away that I think has broad relevance for just people in community.
That's fascinating. I think, you know, and as we see maybe kind of the rise of maybe secularism, maybe one of the responses is this dramatic canceling, which is the opposite of this opportunity to change and change course. That's really helpful, man. We really appreciate your scholarship, you taking your time to hang out with us for a little bit. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, guys. It's been a pleasure, and all the best to you all.
Take care.
All right.